Hello, we're back today to talk about the intermediate state. The intermediate state is the period of time, as we said in our last video, between physical life here on this earth and resurrected life in the eschaton. It's the time period between physical death and the resurrection of the body. What do we know about the intermediate state? Well, we probably know more than we think we do, but maybe not. A couple verses in the New Testament that lead us to the understanding of an intermediate state come from the letters of Paul. One of them is the famous one that we're all familiar with: to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, and also to live as Christ and to die as gain. We all understand that those speak of the intermediate state. They speak of the time after physical death, but before the resurrection. Now, the intermediate state applies to both believers and unbelievers. So now, unbelievers aren't raised to life eternal in the end, but all participate in the intermediate state as well as we know. Now, again, we want to always be aware that there is a line between what we know for sure and what we might think we know. And I want to try to keep that line as pronounced as I can, because sometimes we tend to overstep our knowledge and overstep our bounds, say things that we probably shouldn't say. And I don't want to do that. I just want to keep with what we know for sure and what we know, and be aware of the things that we may not know clearly. Excuse me. In the Old Testament, the intermediate state was Sheol, which is the Hebrew word that is translated the grave. The concept of Sheol goes all the way back to Jacob. See 1 Corinthians 15:4. Looking ahead to Jesus, we see this in Psalm 16:10, 19:5, 33, 49:15, 86:13, 89:48, and Hosea 13:14. So we have all of these examples of going to Sheol. Now, a lot of times in our King James Version Bible, Sheol gets translated hell. And that's a bad translation, because Sheol just means the grave. In the Old Testament, there did not seem to be any sort of difference between the Sheol for good people and the Sheol for bad people. It was the grave. This is an area where, from the Old Testament to the New Testament, a lot more was revealed. And especially a lot more was revealed in the coming of Jesus Christ and in his teachings, so that we know more in the New Testament time about the afterlife, for lack of a better word, than we knew in the Old Testament, or the Old Testament folks knew themselves. One of the examples that's often misapplied is David's weeping over his child. Now, you will recall that when David and Bathsheba got together and committed adultery, and Bathsheba's husband was arranged to be killed in battle by David, that she became pregnant. And then when that child was born, that child died. And when David wept over the child, he said, "You will not always be there alone." Beware of thinking that David was talking about his child going to heaven. I don't think that David and that time period understood heaven and hell, not nearly as clearly as in New Testament times. David said that he would go where his infant son was one day. Now, we often misapply that and say, well, the child is in heaven. Well, the child may very well have been in heaven, but David, or at least in something that we think of resembling heaven, but David didn't know that. David knew of the child going to the grave. David knew of the child going to Sheol. And it is extremely unlikely that David has any concept of heaven like we do. Now, that's not to say that it didn't exist. It's just to say that he didn't understand it, because a lot of revelation has come along since David. Now, even though that David was a man after God's own heart, and that he was highly favored by God, there was just some things he didn't know. And so we, as Christians, probably have a clearer perspective of what all this looks like than even David did. So when David says that he would one day go where his child is, what he means in his context is the grave. And it's wrong for us to misapply that and say that David believed his child was in heaven. Because we don't, like I said, they didn't really understand heaven as we do. His idea of the afterlife was Sheol. So all David is confessing there is that he would one day join his child in the grave. And I believe that's all we can say about that with any certainty. Now, shifting to the New Testament, the intermediate state is divided into two parts. And we see this in Luke 16. And that is the story of the rich man and Lazarus, where Lazarus is a beggar that begged outside of the rich man's gate. Both of them die. The angels come and carry Lazarus into Abraham's bosom where he's comforted, but the rich man is cast into a place of torment. And there's a gulf between them that cannot be crossed, so that the rich man cannot go to Lazarus and be comforted. He can't even go back to the land of the living and warn his brothers of their impending fate. So there is a division also that we see from Jesus' words to the thief on the cross. This good place is called paradise. It's the place where all of the good people go when they die, at least as we can tell from Luke 16, and as well as the martyred souls in Revelation chapter 6, where immediately following the four horsemen. Now, on the other side is the bad place, which is called sometimes Hades, sometimes Gehenna, and sometimes hell. It's interesting that all of these names are kind of figurative to describe the place of torment in the intermediate state. It's a place of suffering that is separate from paradise, but not far away. Because if Jesus' words are to be found to be not in a sense a parable, but in the sense of saying something that is pointing toward truth, and I'm not saying that Jesus lied. Let me reiterate that. Sometimes Jesus' parables are there to tell a story. It's not explicit that Lazarus and the rich man is a parable, but the way Jesus tells it, that the rich man saw Lazarus. So it seems as though in the intermediate state, there is a way to see from the bad place to the good place. And I think that's interesting, but I don't know what to make of it. And back to the words, hell, Gehenna, Hades. Gehenna is a valley outside of Jerusalem, the valley of Hinnom, which was the local burn barrel. It was the garbage dump where everything was on fire because they continually burned their garbage there. So we have paradise on one hand, and then we have Hades or hell or Gehenna on the other. And this seems to be the New Testament division of the intermediate state, where the good go to paradise, the bad go to hell, Hades, or Gehenna. But again, it is not eternal. It is temporal. It is an intermediate state where all await the resurrection of the dead. So then, there's another question we must ask based on what we know from Roman Catholicism. What about limbo and purgatory? Of course, both are Roman Catholic concepts. Limbo, or in Latin, limbus infantum, is the place where unbaptized babies go when they die. Remember, in Roman Catholic theology, if one is not baptized, one cannot be saved. But unbaptized babies who die go to a place called limbo. And that is the nicest place of hell. I call it hell with air conditioning. It's a place where the babies aren't tormented, but yet they are restricted from ever beholding the beatific vision, from seeing the face of God, because they were not baptized. But that's what limbo is. And then purgatory is the place where believers go when they die to be purged of their sins, purged to be able or to be fit to enter paradise. Now, one of the reasons that Protestants like myself cannot come to accept the idea of purgatory is that there is no biblical evidence. Well, Roman Catholics will point to the book of 2nd Maccabees as biblical evidence. The problem is, I don't accept 2nd Maccabees as scripture. It's one of the apocryphal Old Testament books, but I don't consider it to be the Word of God. So it's an old book, it's an ancient book, and it's got some useful information in it, but I don't consider it to be authoritative as Roman Catholics do. So I don't accept purgatory, but it's an interesting concept, and many Protestants even accept purgatory. C.S. Lewis, the famous apologist and fantasy writer, believed in purgatory. And again, recall from our discussion of sacraments some while back, the reason that purgatory exists, the reason that indulgences exist is to help people get out of purgatory. An indulgence is like a get out of purgatory free card, or get out of purgatory, or reduce your time in purgatory card. It's like a 50% off sale. If you do something really good or you buy it, you can reduce your time. One other thing that's worth mentioning, especially as this video is being made, the Roman Catholic Church is discussing canonization of a couple of people. One is Pope John Paul II, the other is Mother Teresa. Now, canonization means that the Church officially recognizes these folks to be saints. Canonization is the criteria is a wonderfully moral and upright life, along with having worked miracles. And if the Church determines that they are saints and canonized, then they are not in purgatory. As far as we know, they're in purgatory, but they may not be. When the Church finally canonizes them, which they probably will canonize both in due time, all that will prove is that they were never in purgatory in the first place, and they have moved on to paradise fully and completely because their merits outweigh what need to be purged. So that's a quick discussion of limbo and purgatory, but the real point, what we want to talk about, is this intermediate state. That's a term that most Christians are not familiar with, even though we talk about it a lot, especially at funerals. Because when we believe, or we'll say, that a person who dies has gone on to their eternal reward. And that's not completely true. Yes, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, and yes, for us to live as Christ and to die as gain. Those are perfectly scriptural ideas. But the fullness of our reward does not come until the resurrection of the body. Now, you hear it preached at funerals all the time that they've gone home. Again, not completely true. The intermediate state, that is the time between physical death and the resurrection of the body, is temporary. It is a holding pattern, a holding tank, if you will. It's not permanent. It's not home. Home is in our resurrected body. Home is the new Jerusalem, the new heavens, and the new earth. The intermediate state is not permanent. The relationship that we begin to enjoy in the intermediate state is permanent if we are believers. But the intermediate state itself is not permanent. And wherever we go, and I don't understand it, but wherever we go 10 minutes after we're dead, is not permanent, because the resurrection of the body has not yet taken place. And that's when we get to permanence. And we'll talk about that in our very next video. So hang on, and we'll talk about it just in a minute.